After the defeat of Tsarist Russia by Imperial Japan, um, Korea was basically a prime target for Japanese imperialism, and in 1910, Japan annexed the whole of Korea. It was an extremely horrible time period in the history of Korea. Basically, any and all opposition to the Japanese occupation was brutally repressed. There are cases where there were peaceful protests. The Japanese military and local puppets would just open fire on them. Um, and so many Koreans, including Kim Il-sung, fled from Korea into Manchuria. And Kim Il-sung, in June of 1926, at the age of 14, left Fusong for Huadian in Manchuria, where he enrolled in the Hwasong Yusuk School, which is a military political school run by Korean nationalists. The Huadian city is it's a major city where a lot of Koreans who fled the Japanese occupation went to in Manchuria. And in the early days of when Kim Il-sung was in this university or this school, he was very critical of the nationalists, and there's a quote from him saying that both the capitalist and feudal societies are those in which the rich live in comfort by exploiting the workers and peasants. One of the issues that he pointed out was that they didn't have much mass support, and they over idealized like previous society, and didn't take into account that those previous societies there was a system of oppression by one class. In Huadian, there were several communist organizations that were active there before Kim Il-sung began organizing, but they were very these organizations were very sectarian and very dogmatic. They would, rather than organize amongst the Koreans, they would argue amongst themselves about who's the more orthodox faction and who's going to be recognized by the Communist International. I think we see a lot of similar things with certain leftist organizations today. That's something that's continuing till today. So Kim Il-sung, he was very critical of the nationalists for their lack of militancy and their lack of mass support. And he was also critical of the existing communist factions for their factionalism and dogmatism. And he understood that a new organization would need to be formed, which would need to have revolutionary politics and mass appeal. And on October 17th, 1926, Kim Il-sung organized a study group called the Down with Imperialism Union, which stood for the overthrow of Japanese imperialism in Korea and the building of socialism and communism in Korea. And this is in 1926, is at the age of 14. All the resources of Korea were basically under the ownership of Imperial Japan, and all of the labor power of Korea was under control of Imperial Japan. And there was a lot of Japanese supremacism, and that Korean culture was suppressed. The Japanese tried to perpetrate a myth saying that the Koreans don't exist. These people are not Koreans, they're Japanese. They're part of the quote-unquote Yamamoto race. So it wasn't only economic and political, it was also, they had a very racist, they tried to ideologically defend this oppression with a racist ideology. In 1926, Kim Il-sung organized the Down with Imperialism Union, which is a communist organization. And then on December 15th of that year, 1926, Kim Il-sung, along with other young revolutionaries, which he won over towards revolutionary politics from his school, formed the Sinal Juvenile Union. And the goal of the SJU was to provide ideological and military training for youth. And at this point, this is before the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. At this point, there's more freedom to organize in Manchuria as opposed to what came later. Around this time, I wasn't able to find out. There's not a lot of information available. I wasn't able to find the exact year, but around this time, in the mid 1920s, Kim Il Sung formed the Young Communist League of Korea. The majority of the membership was of poor peasantry, and it was during this time when Kim Il Sung and his comrades read works such as the Communist Manifesto and Capital from Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, and Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and State and Revolution from Lenin. Basically, in the latter half of the 1920s, these organizations led by the Young Communist League of Korea stepped up their activities to include not only legal but illegal forms of struggle. And the Japanese imperialists and reactionary Chinese warlords in Manchuria basically were beginning to see the Young Communist League of Korea as more of a threat, and they sent spies into their ranks. That's something, a repeated tactic by the reactionaries, such as we see that in COINTELPRO, and even till today, that's a very common tactic. And the Japanese imperialists also embedded reactionary teachers into these schools where the Korean youth were taking classes, basically to try and stifle any revolutionary activity. And in October of 1928, Kim Il Sung led a very large militant protest against the Japanese-owned Jilin Horyong Railway, which was a very important, strategically very important for the coming Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And this protest connected the Young Communist League of Korea to the Korean railway workers who were working on this. So this is a very important turning point in not only organizing the youth, but connecting it to the Korean working class as well. And in 1928, the Young Communist League of Korea organized a broad-based boycott of Japanese products in Manchuria. And Kim Il Sung also organized a student strike in the UN Middle School in Jilin, which is in southern Manchuria near the border with Korea.
When they began doing the political and military training for the youth, I mean, there had to be some sort of funding or some sort of monetary stipend in order for them to accomplish all these activities, you know? Who were their aid, like?
At this point, they were basically getting it from local Korean nationalists. At this point, I don't think any states like the Soviet Union or anyone was backing them at this point. I think it was basically they were getting support from the other Korean nationalists.
And do you think, with boycott movements of today, like against Israel or something like that, that there's sort of this effort maybe to diffuse that you should, they should be against, companies or products that are produced in like the, so-called occupied areas compared to other parts? Like, do you think that he faced something like that, like in his boycott movements, or there had more that resonated with people right away, do you think?
I wasn't able to find a lot of information, but I know that it was, I do know that it was a broad-based boycott, and it was very popular. I'm not sure what steps the reactionaries took to try and, stop that, but it seemed like it was, quite successful and very broad-based.
Do you think that the reason why our efforts to boycott aren't as successful is because of the existence of monopolies. Like, we don't have the opportunity to boycott a product when we have so many limited products to choose from, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
that makes sense, because I think in this case, most of the people, in this case, are peasantry, live in the country. They'd be a lot less reliant on these types of products to begin with. So I think that's another reason why. But yeah, also the factor of monopoly as well. They're interconnected, I think. Yeah. So already the Japanese saw Kim Il Sung and the youth revolutionaries as a threat. But after these activities, they've really stepped up their attempts to repress the Korean revolutionaries. And in 1929, Kim Il Sung was actually arrested and sent to the Jilin prison without a trial. And while he was in prison, he continued to organize. He spoke with other inmates, and there's a recorded case where one inmate came up to him and said, "I hear you're a communist." And Kim Il Sung responds, "Yes, I am a communist." And the inmate isn't, sure necessarily what that means. He says, "I've been told that communists are bandits," and things like that. And Kim Il Sung puts forward a very good quote that basically it says that only the rich and the powerful fear communists, because they are the ones who are basically our target. And besides ideological, he spoke with other prisoners there, and not only did he engage in ideological organization with the other inmates, but he organized a hunger strike, in fact, which was very successful and had wide support throughout the prison. They were very united in it, and he was able to send out a message to his other comrades outside of the prison that they're taking part in a hunger strike. And once that came out, the local press heard about it, and a lot of letters were sent to the administrators of the prison, and they got a lot of basically condemnations because the prison, the hunger strike was a response to heavy abuses by the authorities, many cases of torture, and basically it was a success. The prison authorities were forced to release Kim Il Sung within 5 days of the hunger strike due to quote unquote lack of evidence. And not only was Kim Il Sung released, but many other members of the Young Communist League of Korea were released. And again, I think this is an interesting connection, because we see a lot of issues with hunger strikes going on now. That you had a point?
I was gonna say, who forced the release of Kim Il Sung? Because like you were gonna mention, you see a lot of hunger strikes in Mexico. You have people lighting themselves on fire. Nonetheless, like, there is no reaction or there is no solution. So where is this? Who forced like his release, or what power like let this like happen?
Yeah, I think why it was successful was that not only was it Kim Il Sung and just a band of like 4 or 5 prisoners, but it was all of the. I don't think all the inmates took part in the hunger strike, but basically all of the inmates would chant in support of them and basically yell and try to intimidate the guards. And there was basically the community around the prison was basically in uprising. Maybe not through arms at that point, but basically through protests and making condemnation. So I'd say the combination of, very shoddy, not even, they even admitted there was no evidence and there was no trial when Kim Il Sung was put in prison, and many of the others, that was the case, the other Korean revolutionaries. So there's a combination of no evidence in combination with unity within the people taking part in the hunger strike, in combination with the solidarity from the local surrounding area, the local community. I think that's basically why it was successful.
Sounds like it was more trouble to have him locked up than it was to have him outside. Like
Yeah.
by having him locked up and doing all these hunger strikes and everyone's protesting the prison and all of this, the guards are just like, okay, just let this guy out so then we can go back to just running our prison normally.
Yeah. Kim Il-sung, who, the great revolutionary leader who defeated the Japanese imperialists, later defeated the U.S. imperialists and sellout puppets, he started out trying to organize study groups, a very small, seemingly very simple thing, but we all start, all these revolutionaries start somewhere. But I think that's a very good point. The ruling class in this, as addressing that, why this is more effective than stuff going on now, like prison solidarity and stuff like that. The ruling class here, I think, is extremely strong, maybe the strongest ruling class in the history of the world, maybe. And as opposed to the ruling class in Manchuria at that point, which is basically a comprador ruling class whose power was, I would say, very extremely weak at that point. So they basically, it was a lot easier to defeat them. And it would take less to make them have to compromise. But continuing on, in 1930, when Kim Il-sung was released from prison, this was getting to be around the time when Japan was moving into Manchuria. I believe it was in 1932 or somewhere around there when Japan had finally invaded Manchuria. And the Korean communists basically understood that what needed to be done was guerrilla activity and organizing a people's army to fight against the Japanese occupation. And on April 25th, 1932, Kim Il-sung organized the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, which later became what is in Korea now, the Korean People's Army. And before I go further, I want to mention another great Korean revolutionary, Kim Jong-suk, who she's another very important revolutionary leader of the Korean People's Army. She played a very important role in organizing the peasantry and organizing women in particular in the Korean People's Army. And one specific case of her heroism was, and there was an incident where the Korean People's Army was confronting the Japanese military, and Kim Jong-suk jumped in front of Kim Il-sung to protect him from enemy fire and shot down the nearby enemy. And eventually, Kim Jong-suk married Kim Il-sung in 1941, and in 1941, Kim Jong-il was born on February 16th of that year in a base stationed on Mount Paektu in Korea. And yeah, I think Kim Jong-suk is someone I myself have to learn more about, but I think everyone needs to learn more about Kim Jong-suk because she's a very good example of a woman revolutionary who actively took part in armed struggle and was on the forefront of it. So basically summing up, the revolutionary struggle carried out by the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, it took a long time for it to be successful, but it eventually achieved victory. And on September 9th, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed